Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, these are programs we've been running through the lockdown on a range of issues, in particular the legal, economic and social health questions related to the lockdown. Today we changed tune to some extent, but I would hope that you will find this a particularly intriguing and interesting discussion because Professor Imraan Covadia from the University of Cape Town has written what I think is quite a remarkable book called Revolution and Nonviolence in Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Mandela, which speaks so much to our present condition that I thought it would be absolutely appropriate to have him on and to talk about this book, which has not yet been published, as I understand it, but is about to be, if I'm right. So can I ask you, Imraan, what was the conceit of, because obviously I'm talking to you and almost everybody's going to listen to this, probably everybody has not read this thing. So I'm just interested in the conceit between Tolstoy, Mandela, and Gandhi. You know, as to how you weave, why you chose.
Well, they were much more closely connected than think people realized. When you read Mandela's diaries and letters, it turns out that a very interesting character of Tolstoy's was his favorite character. The only literary character he mentions in all of his correspondence was a general in War and Peace. And Mandela himself always cast himself as a disciple of Gandhi. It's a very strange thing, obviously, for someone who started Umkhonto we Sizwe to choose an icon of nonviolence. So it started from this question of what is the relationship between violence and nonviolence, particularly in our country, but also in countries which were colonies and part of empires.
And I mean, what I found particularly interesting was that Mandela and Gandhi, to an extent, to the ordinary person, I know, A Long Walk to Freedom is a significant, very significant book, and I didn't realize that Gandhi's letters until I read your book, and these were run to 100 volumes. I didn't realize that at all. But I mean, obviously, for anybody listening to this, Tolstoy is the person they categorize as the novelist because of the two great novels, which you kind of locate fantastically into this book, and War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But actually, Tolstoy had a lot, as I understand it, to talk about the same problem about violence and non-violence in social.
Yeah, the connection is direct. The last real letters of Tolstoy's life were written to Gandhi, and Gandhi was throughout his life, he was most interested, I would say, in Tolstoy. I think because Tolstoy represented a skeptical view of the West and an aristocrat's opposition to the aristocracy and to empire. But I think we also misremember Tolstoy. We read him through these amazing novels we have and short stories, and we forget that he was an inveterate pamphleteer. He wrote about vegetarianism, he wrote about nonviolence, he was a campaigner for oppressed minorities. He's a really extraordinary figure. For me, he is the great figure of 19th century revolution. I feel much closer to him than to someone like Marx or Nietzsche, because he had an incredible humanity and simplicity about him and a kind of skepticism that still is exextraordinary.
So someone like Kutuzov, the great general in War and Peace, who I hadn't thought about it this way. He's an intriguing character because you'd hardly think of him as a great general the way you would of some of the great generals of modern era. But yet, somehow, there's a linkage that you draw between him and Mandela.
Yeah, well, Mandela drew it himself. The one thing he really remembered from Tolstoy was, here's this general, Kutuzov, and he said, everybody misremembers Kutuzov. Everybody looked down on Kutuzov, said what a terrible general he was. And he was a terrible general. Again, he was too fat to be on a horse. He was blind in one eye. The Tsar hated him. He spent his time reading novels and flirting with younger women. So he was the most unprofessional general you could imagine. And what Mandela said was the thing he understood was that he understood the national feeling of his people, and he could incarnate it. And so you have this incredible paradox. Most of our listeners will know that the French managed to kind of beat themselves in the 1812 invasion. But Tolstoy presents Kutuzov as someone who was both a general and yet was an amazing figure of nonviolence, who wanted to spare people, who wanted to prevent people dying. That is such an incredible thing. And I think that's probably what really struck Mandela, what pierced him. And I think it's also what what he is for us. It's someone who was a figure of force, a guerrilla at some level, but also someone who prevented violence and is as
Well,
more so.
that's the interesting thing about Mandela, is if I could get onto him, as I said to you, because in one interview, one could talk about this book forever, but just focusing on Mandela, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the John Coetzee part right at the end as well, if I may. But on the Mandela, I mean, Mandela himself, as you locate the book, yes, it's true he started in Mkontwe, but there was obviously in Konto, but there was clearly a tension there. He wasn't exactly what you'd call a committed person to violent action, to the contrary.
Absolutely. And that I mean, you know, the other part of the thing that gave rise to this book was the amazing atmosphere of antagonism we live in South Africa. You know, I mean, particularly true after Mandela died. We saw, in a way, those currents of antagonism and enmity in our society, whether it's from the EFF or whether it's from the DA or whoever it's from. And Mandela is this amazing figure because he incarnates the pride of a majority, but he does it without antagonism. And in fact, Gandhi and Tolstoy did that too. It's an incredible, incredible thing. And I think we don't appreciate how wonderful it is until it's gone. You know, that ability to be proud of your country, to mobilize it. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to ask you, because your book opens, and as somebody who has for years both taught and read Hannah Arendt, it's an intriguing opening of the exchange between her and Gershom Scholem, which was itself interesting for other reasons, but let me get there. But what I found interesting was the kind of idea that Arendt has of cosmopolitanism. And you've got a quote from Mandela where you say, cosmopolitan dreams, he says, are not only desirable, but in fact a bounded duty. So you locate him then as, in a sense, almost the preeminent cosmopolitan of the latter part of the 20th century, given his stature.
I think, look, one problem with being an academic is you tend to overvalue thought. So if we're looking for specific doctrine of Mandela's, we probably on globalization, we won't find it. But if we're looking for someone who lived through what it meant to be both like a very proud African person, but also completely open to the currents of the world and to the best of the world, I think he lived that in a way that very few people have ever lived it. So I think as a true figure of globalism, he's absolutely astonishing person in many ways. And sorry.
No, carry on, please.
And I think that is in some ways the most extraordinary part of his legacy is his ability to imagine, despite these currents of hostility and enmity, to imagine a kind of openness to the world that never flagged, you know, whether it was to the Spice Girls or to, to Bill Clinton and so forth.
But I mean, the thing that I suppose, as I read it, it sort of reminded me, I only met him about 4 or 5 times. And every time I met him, he kind of didn't make me feel like a white person. I didn't feel that he saw me.
Or me, Dennis.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I know that's kind of perhaps romanticizing it, but there was something about him which in a sense transcended that boundary. I mean, so when he spoke about cosmopolitan being a bounded duty, I mean, perhaps you're right that one puts too much of both of us as academics put an academic spin on it, but there is something profound about that. And I suppose what I wanted to ask you was, you cite at some point Achille Mbembe talking about idolatry of race. And there is a counterposition, it seems to me, between the idolatry of race and what you mine out of the Mandela comparison to Tolstoy, indeed to Gandhi. And I suppose here we are in 2021. Was this a fleeting moment that we were going to have somebody like Mandela who would transcend the idea of the idolatry of race in the concept of South Africa in the 21st century?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we're going to go through currents of enmity, hostility, adversariality in our country, and we see them in other countries now as well. But I think the underlying forces of science and technology and economic progress are more firmly established than ever. And I don't think those are going to go away. And I don't think ordinary people's desire to participate in them is going to go away.
So I wanted to ask you about that because you also quote Arendt at one particular point in time about, because she appears quite often in the text, and quote, I think, in the terms of the question of compassion and poverty, and and you don't really, in relation to then quotes the French Revolution, you cite that as an example, that doesn't go anywhere except in the violent fashion. And is that where we are now? Or, I mean, because we've got serious poverty now, and the best we've got is a little bit of compassion, but not by many.
Look, that is an old idea of Arendt's, which is almost too dangerous for most people to even think about, that compassion is a problem of democratic politics. And it's very built, I mean, I don't think it's wrong that it's built into us that compassion is a very good thing, that wanting to alleviate social problems is a positive thing. But I think the essence of this is the problem of poverty. And, as Jesus pointed out, the poor are always going to be with us, but that doesn't mean we don't want to reduce poverty as much as possible. What you see in Mandela's presidency is an incredibly flexible approach towards reducing poverty, and a man who always understood compromises. And that, to me, the very greatest politicians, they both achieve amazing things, but they always understand there are trade-offs between this one thing and another thing. So when Mandela says, for example, we could increase the minimum wage, but that will, that has certain things we have to balance. We could downsize the army, but that leaves a lot of very well-trained men on the streets and so forth. This is someone who thinks all the time about the acts of balancing one thing against the other. And I think if we want to truly reduce poverty, we have to think in those ways rather than the very dogma. Even the most brilliant men who run our government, and there are some, don't seem to understand the trade-off between having the state do everything and the reduction of poverty. And I think Mandela understood that very clearly. And it worries me that we put all our hopes in the question of poverty reduction into the state when it clearly isn't functioning very well. And I think, in fact, one of the things that I most learned from Mandela and Gandhi and Tolstoy is a fear of the state as the central organ of anything. They didn't necessarily trust the market, but they knew that the state couldn't be trusted either. I think that's something we probably need back.
And Mandela, you also talk about Mandela on the island in a way slightly differently to Tolstoy, and obviously because of different experience, almost as a preparation. For what came out, but not in the way normal people, not in the way that the ordinary person has spoken about it, but in a really profound sense of the relationship between the individual and the community. I mean, there seems to be something, as you mine out of this text of his experience, something about that experience that really kind of allowed him to negotiate those dichotomies of which you're talking.
It seems like it, and look, it's probably a trick of the mind, because who knows where depth in a person comes from. It certainly doesn't always come from being locked up, but the extent to which he seems to have engaged with problems, the extent to which he was a patient leader, that intense dream life he had on the island, the dreams of winning, the letters he wrote. There's nothing before 1959 that you see in Mandela that says anything like that. I mean, he was a very handsome man, very charming man, but there's nothing of that intense depth and radicalism which seems to emerge on the island. And I don't know any of the other prisoners who benefited from it quite in the same way. I mean, there were many who were cleverer than Mandela, I think. I think Mac Maharaj was a very clever person. But
yes,
you don't
yes.
that kind of strange, you have to talk about it as a kind of spiritual journey. I mean, he had incredible inner life, incredible depth. As Dennis, as you get gray hairs, there are younger people who come along and dismiss entirely the things that you find interesting. And, I know at UCT, if you say the word Mandela, people kind of laugh at you. Someone was a very nice person was indignant with me a few weeks ago because I mentioned Mandela, and she said, "I can't believe you did that. You just mentioned Mandela in a positive way." And I mean, I think she was joking, but
is that because we are captives of what? The idolatry of race, to use the term again? Is it because, in the sense of the massive promise that Mandela, as it were, held out for us, and the fact of the degrading realities that the vast majority of South Africans face on a daily basis? What is it about that I read it? Yes, with grey hairs, and thank you for reminding me. I read this, and the way you weave this, I've concentrated on Mandela for obvious reasons, but the way you weave it with two other extraordinary figures of Tolstoy and Gandhi. And as you say, I was wondering as I was reading it, what my students would say about this. how would I present the text to them? And I
Well,
know that, yeah.
no,
But
I mean, a very good question.
I want you to respond to that because I wanted to ask you something which flows out of the text in relation. But please,
Yeah.
if you want, please.
I think, first of all, the shocking thing about a lot of this is that the themes that were very alive to them, is poverty, everyday poverty and breakdown, interpersonal violence, racial enmity, they were as alive to them as they are to us. And it's scary that our country, in a way, can reproduce the same problems generation after generation. And I think what they offer is an extraordinary original understanding of those things, taken in a sense not from books ultimately, but from experience and so forth. And so they offer different kinds of alternative paths. And there are many reasons to dismiss them. I mean, none of these figures are really as alive as one would think. But they also offer, I mean, for me, just reading through all this material and trying to understand it, it was like really coming into contact with three extraordinary spirits, three extraordinary human beings, who I think are really underrated. I mean, it's hard to say that Tolstoy is underrated, but nobody remembers his vegetarianism, for example, or his campaigning for people who were being persecuted, these extraordinary things.
I think what comes out of your book, by the way, if I may say, is nobody sees the politics of Tolstoy precisely as you've shown it. I mean, and it speaks literally from the grave 100 years on in the way it does, because clearly, given where we are with people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi, let's be blunt about it, bearing in mind where comparison to Gandhi, etc., all of them, we've got all these people, and when you think about it, here is somebody who's engaging with the idea of a kind of a non-violent revolution in circumstances where we've got the very antithesis of everything that they thought was actually represented good governance. But I wonder if I can carry on and ask you, there's an interesting, I thought very brave, I have to tell you, I've got to take my hat off to you. Brave,
in South Africa, whenever anyone says you're being brave, you're in lots and lots of trouble.
No, I don't know whether you're going to be in trouble. I think you did very well. That's what's particularly interesting, was the counterposition between Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela. And yeah, please.
No, go on.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. Look, I think we can't distort the facts. When there's clear evidence of Winnie Mandela being involved in very, very serious abuses, right? But there's a lot of very interesting feminist scholarship about why has she been presented in this way. And I do think that she represents the limits of a certain case, the kind of, in a sense, high-minded case that Gandhi and Tolstoy and Mandela make about convert your adversary, honor your enemy, try and reconcile him or redirect him. Those are wonderful arguments. They're not things we can do without at many levels, but they also don't seem to get hold of that world in which Winnie Mandela lived, in which there were spies and extreme physical violence directed towards her, and in which, of course, she herself internally responded to that. So I just think it's a very interesting warning case about the problem of nonviolence and where nonviolence can't go anymore, whether nonviolent there parts of the world that nonviolence can't reach.
Well, I thought that was particularly interesting because there's a passage in the book where you talk about Gandhi having to dress as a woman to escape in Durban Harbour, I think it was. Mandela having been given a tin teacup, I assume, one of those tin mugs that racist South Africa were given to black people, opposed to the fancy stuff to white people. And you then say, well, those are terribly demeaning, but nothing of the order of magnitude that she suffered over a very sustained period, which in a sense gets one to reflect on the conditionality of when you can, in a sense, show that level of generosity. And it troubles me. I don't, because what you show in your text is quite unashamedly and very accurately a whole range of stuff with regard to Winnie Mandela, but there's that tension between that and going back to the conditions which she suffered for a very long period, having a arm broken, all of the oppression and Brandfort, etc., etc.
And I think what we have to conclude from that is nonviolence is not always applicable. The interesting, if you look at Gandhi's career, he tried to make nonviolence applicable to all kinds of situations. I mean, the most controversial aspects of his application of nonviolence. Of course, his letter to Hitler and his famous advice to the Jews of Germany, when he kind of told them, go get killed. It'll improve the Germans. So and I think Hannah Arendt and others pointed out quite correctly, nonviolence only exists in certain spaces. And what's interesting is over the last 3 months, we've seen that the United States, the greatest political movement in the United States history in generations is this incredible movement of nonviolence, and obviously it probably wouldn't exist in Putin's Russia or China.
But I was thinking about that, and thank you for raising that, because as I read your book, last night, and obviously not just last night, but over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of celebration of the life of John Lewis. And last night there was a eulogy by Barack Obama. What an extraordinary thing to think that once had a president like that, look what they've got now. But be that as it may, would John Lewis fit into that? His life seemed to be one of extraordinary generosity in the same way that you describe of these other people that you spoke about, not perhaps in the same great stature. I suspect in 50 years' time we won't have a book written about Tolstoy, Gandhi, Mandela, and Lewis, but it seems to be of a similar approach.
Yes. No, I think that, I think the other thing is I have much more, I'm kind of a pragmatist. I feel like, I have the same views as many Americans about the Second World War, probably many of us. There's occasions when you have to use violence. But I think reading through many of these people and understanding their successes, I have much more appreciation for just the sheer forcefulness of nonviolence and the way it united African Americans of many different kinds and people around the world. It was and still is an amazing international movement, even if it's not always applicable. The other thing is, what is our connection to the American experience of civil rights? And I have to say that I think that that's one particular experience, but I do think it's a certain kind of experience. We shouldn't read everything through the way that the 1950s and 1960s worked out in the US. I just think the stakes were very different. And I think even then, the stakes in the Northeast of the United States are different from, say, Alabama and Mississippi. But nonviolence is surprisingly contagious. It definitely, the connections between Gandhi and Martin Luther King or someone like John Lewis are very close.
So I wonder if I can, because I'm running out of time, I want to just talk about the last chapter where your book turns attention to the counterposition between Tolstoy and John Coetzee, and in particular, Age of Iron and The Master of St. Petersburg and Disgrace in particular, because it seemed to me that was the one that was the most controversial of all for most of us. And I suppose what I'm going to ask you quite bluntly is, where do you classify Coetzee here?
I'm not sure. The funny thing is my wife looked at me when I was suggested writing a Coetzee chapter, and she said, do you really want to put him in the company of those other people?
Well, that's what I'm asking, I suppose, yes. So I'm in good company by asking the question.
The difference between these others and Coetzee ultimately is they were prepared to die. They weren't, in some sense, and I'm not saying that it's wrong to want to preserve your own life or happiness or even your space as a writer or artist or whatever, but they really were prepared to give all of it up. And that lends what they do a kind of grandness and intensity that's very different from the kind of academic and literary stakes you see in Coetzee. Having said that, Coetzee is very brilliant. He has some of the genius of Tolstoy's skepticism, his ability to peel away the layers of reality. And he can be a very great writer. So he has part of it. He certainly understands the way he does articulate something that most writers feel, which is Tolstoy is a magician. It's the same way Mandela is a magician and Obama is a magician. There's a kind of grace that they have. It's kind of supernatural. If you see certain athletes, So Coetzee feels that way about Tolstoy. There's a magical quality about it. But I don't think he can ultimately follow him, because Tolstoy ultimately pushes it all the way. He's like Gandhi. When he feels that something is oppressive, he gives it up. He wanted to surrender his life, his property. He wanted to give himself over to the public and to oppressed people. And I think in some ways that's the disappointment of being a professional like Coetzee, is that you can't ultimately you won't give yourself over for whatever set of reasons.
But when you trace, and it's fascinating, because it made me want to go and read all these books yet again, Coetzee's, which of course, like many people have done. The question was this: you counterpose him to some of the other figures in literature, presumably South African. And the compliment you pay him is that he transcended the kind of traditional oeuvre of writing in a very profound way. But yet at the end of it, it seems to me, reading you, he still can't escape a particular framework which perhaps many of us were located in and find it very difficult to move out of into something revolutionary, if I could put it that way.
Mm-hmm. I think probably the thing that's most troubling about his later career is the extent to which he gets rid of the burden of being South African, and also the extent to which there are certain parts of his writing, I think, which in a way takes Black people as a backdrop or a theme or something to be exercised on. And there's a certain sense of, look, I love intellectual games, and apparently Coetzee loved games as a child. So, but there's a certain point at which you have to let go of the game, and the wonderful thing about Gandhi, Mandela, and Tolstoy is they were really focused on what was not a game, on poverty, on death, on illness, and interdependence. And I think, look, maybe it's true of all of us. It finds us wanting. We can't let go of the game. We can't let go of our individual lives in different ways. And, maybe it's not a criticism. It's just a fact.
But Disgrace was the last book he wrote whilst he was still in South Africa. And it created a controversy. You don't seem to buy the traditional criticism or the traditional observation well, the way in which certain people negotiated the idea of Coetzee's version. Atwell's idea, for example, trying to gloss over the rape and the whole narrative of Disgrace, does leave one with very troubling thoughts at the end of it all. As to
yeah, absolutely. I have to think. I've thought about that scene now since I read it. 15, 20 years ago, probably as many of us have. And then I finally occurred to me, and I say this in the book. What would if a German writer had written a scene with 3 Jewish men raping a German woman in 1950? How would we read it? And a lot of this depends on our sensitivities. And I think Mandela felt this. You remember there's this amazing scene in Mandela's autobiography where he sees a poor white woman for the first time. He thinks, this is so terrible. How can this poor? And then he thinks to him, and look, it is terrible. Nobody should be poor. But he thinks to himself, but I feel white poverty more than I feel Black poverty. And of course, that's the way our minds work. And similarly, if we see some obvious horrendous stereotype of a Jewish person, we're all pretty sensitive. I am pretty sensitive to it. And yet, when we see the same stereotype being used by Coetzee about an African person, we don't respond. And I think we should respond in different ways. We should ask questions. We should ask, where does that impulse to create that scene come from, and so forth. Instead of, in South Africa, we seem to kind of, along racial lines, we just create alibis for whoever is on our side of different kinds. And I think we're better off without the alibis.
But you see, when I read that, and going back to the fact that I keep on banging on about this line that you quote from Achille, about the idolatry of race, I thought, well, that's exactly that. Because if you were a white person writing that kind and you wanted a rape scene, well, hello, that's exactly how that would play out. There's nothing revolutionary about that. There's nothing about it, in a sense, disrupting the traditional narrative, which is why I found it so troubling.
Yes. No, I think we should keep finding it troubling in different ways. Yeah, absolutely.
One other question, I suppose, just going back to that, which reminded me, I found, there's a fascinating description that you have in the Mandela chapter about when Mandela actually is taken secretly around Cape Town, and you quote his description thereof. And what I found extraordinary about that was that the description had no racial references at all. He just spoke about people.
It's amazing, isn't it? And that is an amazing scene.
I guess a guy has been in the town for 40 years or whatever it is, maybe more. That seemed to me, almost that little extract seemed to me summarize exactly what you were talking about in relation to him.
Yeah, I think again that moment with Mandela and the poor white woman, I think one thing we've never really explored in South Africa is to what extent Black people of Mandela's generation, I think of my generation too, really saw white people as very human, and in a sense were open to kind of a very open and almost didn't see white. I find it hard to put it, but they were capable of that kind of vision of just seeing white people as the most human of all humans. And I think that's what happens with Mandela. On the other hand, he had connections to all kinds of people. I mean, all kinds of real estate developers and pop stars, and he always, he managed to connect to all kinds of. I think he also, he loved life, and it is something you see in a kind of Black international tradition, like with Obama and stuff. They kind of love life and love meeting people, and that isn't necessarily true of all politicians or all intellectuals.
So one final question for you. I didn't realize, of course, I suppose I had no reason to, but actually there's a connection, if I may say, between you and your family and Gandhi.
Yes, well, I mean, they, well, we, I guess my great whatever, helped to hire him when he came here. And then one of them, a further one, was a test case when they were testing the segregation ordinances on the Fordsburg tram. Gandhi chose my great whatever to go on the tram. And when the tram started moving, he said, look, I'm not here as a valet. Indians were only allowed as valets. He said, I'm not here as a valet. And so they arrested him, and Gandhi tested that case. That case is a fascinating case. And I think, we have all this unbelievable civil rights history ourselves. And I feel like it's a pity we haven't made more of it. It's wonderful material.
Well, let me say that's a convenient way, because I've run out of time, but it's a convenient way to end, because you've made much of this material. Not only, I haven't even spoken about Gandhi other than that, or Tolstoy, all of which deserve a program all on their own. But can I just say, it's an absolutely fabulous book. I hope that many people read it, because it actually relates to the most fundamental question that we have to really worry about in South Africa. How do we achieve revolution, real change in this country in a non-violent fashion? It seems to me the conundrum of our times, and you've raised it absolutely foursquarely. So congratulations, well done on this book. It's really, I hope many people read it. And thank you very much
Thank you
for your time.
Thank you much.